Okay, let's talk about the distribution and excretion of cocaine, cocaine and the amphetamines, and we'll repeat this in the amphetamines, cross the blood-brain barrier effectively. That's what the BBB is, so sorry for the abbreviation there, but the blood-brain barrier, and it will become concentrated in the spleen, the kidneys, and the brain as well, because the pH in those organs facilitate the ionization of cocaine. Remember, cocaine is a very weak base. Okay, in terms of excretion, cocaine has a half-life of about 40 minutes, and the pH of the urine can affect the excretion of cocaine. Okay, again, recall that cocaine is a very weak base, so when the urine is acidic, the acidity of the urine will cause cocaine, which is a weak base, to ionize. This will cause the cocaine to be trapped in the urine, which means that it cannot be reabsorbed into the bloodstream and back into circulation. So it's going to be trapped in the urine and excreted in the urine. Okay, now a bit on the neurophysiology. This actually will not just be cocaine right now. We'll talk about the psychomotor stimulants in general, and then we'll move on to, I think on the next slide, to talk more specifically about cocaine. Okay, so what most or many of the psychomotor stimulants do is they bind to autoreceptors. Remember back in chapter 4 we talked about autoreceptors, or those self-receptors that are on the presynaptic neuron that has released neurotransmitter into the synapse, right? So by binding to these autoreceptors, remember the autoreceptors, are part of a feedback mechanism that will tell the presynaptic cell not to release additional neurotransmitter into the synapse, etc. So the end result of psychomotor stimulants binding to these autoreceptors is that you will have excess neurotransmitter in the synapse. Okay. What we know is that some of the psychomotor stimulants can also facilitate the release of catecholamines from axon terminals. Okay, but what we're going to talk about now is cocaine more specifically, and how cocaine does what it does. Cocaine blocks the reuptake of dopamine. Okay, remember in chapter 4 as well, we talked about reuptake being one of the processes that can help terminate neurotransmission. Okay, and so with reuptake, you have a neurotransmitter that's being taken back up into the presynaptic terminal. It gets repackaged and stored for use at some later point. Okay, so cocaine is going to block the reuptake of dopamine. And if you prevent this reuptake, prevent this recycling process, then what you're going to end up with is dopamine in the synapse. So you're not going to terminate synaptic action, but you're going to leave that dopamine out there in the synapse to produce synaptic actions. Okay? The other thing is that cocaine can also block sodium ion channels in membranes. Okay, so let's think about that for a second. It can block sodium ion channels in membranes. Okay, sodium ion channels, that's N with the superscript of plus. This is a positive ion. So when sodium ion channels are open, then you would have the flow of positive ions into the cell. Okay, and remember, whenever you have that the flow of positive ions into the cell, you have the potential, I shouldn't use that word, you have the possibility of producing an action potential if you have enough positive ions flow in such that you can depolarize the membrane and cause the production of an action potential. Okay, and so cocaine is blocking these sodium ion channels, and blocking those sodium ion channels, blocking the flow of positive ions into the cell, blocking depolarization of the cell membrane, blocking the production of an action potential. Okay, that effect is associated with the local anesthetic properties of cocaine. You're blocking the pain messages to be sent, essentially, when you're talking about a local anesthetic effect. The pain message does not get sent because you're blocking the production of the action potential. Okay, so let's switch gears just a little bit and talk about the subjective effects of cocaine. Okay, in general, when an individual self-administers cocaine, there are 4 chronological subjective states or stages that the individual goes through. The first is called the freeze. This is the numbing sensation that's associated with the use of cocaine. And remember, just on the previous slide, we talked about the local anesthetic properties of cocaine, okay? The numbing, okay? And this is the freeze that individuals experience shortly after administering cocaine, because you've got the blockage of those action potentials, blocking those sodium ion channels. Okay, the freeze is followed by feelings of well-being and exhilaration. Okay, this is the high that individuals report experiencing, and then you have feelings of energy, clear thoughts, and perceptions. Okay, so for example, powder cocaine has been associated with artsy fartsy crowds, okay? And so some artists, irrespective of the genre, okay, have reported that they've had their clearest thoughts about what it is they'd like to create, how they have envisioned it, perceived it, when they have been under the influence of cocaine, that they're just pretty of clear thought and clear perception. Okay, now what follows all of this is the letdown. Okay, that the individual, after they're coming down from their high, experiences a depression, essentially. So they crash. This leads us into our next slide that talks about the relationship between the dose of cocaine that's self-administered and the crash or the letdown that follows. Okay, and so essentially what we're showing here is that the higher you climb, this represents a ladder, the higher you climb, the harder you fall. Okay, so think about that. If you climb a ladder, the higher up on that ladder you go, okay, the greater the distance that you're going to fall. Okay, and so the higher the high that individuals achieve with cocaine, okay, this euphoria that they achieve, the higher they get, the harder they're going to crash. Okay. Now, cocaine has been described, and I always insert as one of the most, I'm not sure if our textbook still says the most, but as one of the most unsatisfying drugs of abuse. Why is this? This is because it's simply, when an individual self-administers cocaine, it's simply never as good as the first time. So an individual can continue getting high, but they're not going to experience the same type of euphoria that they did the first time they may have self-administered cocaine. And so the individual's essentially chasing a high that they can never achieve again. And so they're taking increasingly high doses, trying to get that high back, but it's really not achievable. Okay, so again, it's never as good as the first time. The individual gets high, but they're just not satisfied because it's just not like the first time. Okay. Now here are some general effects of cocaine. Cocaine constricts blood flow. Okay, remember we talked about constricting mucous membranes in the nasal passages if an individual is snorting cocaine. But just in general, cocaine constricts blood flow. Okay. I don't think I ever asked you about the pupils, so I'm going to skip over that one. The pupils will become more important, or it's more of a telltale sign when we start talking about heroin and the opiate use. Okay, we do know that cocaine and the other psychomotor stimulants activate the sympathetic nervous system. Remember, we said that these drugs were called sympathomimetics because they mimic arousal of the sympathetic nervous system. Okay, remember that's our increased heart rate, increased blood pressure, increased respiration, diversion of blood flow from the digestive processes to the large muscle groups. Okay, Use of cocaine will disrupt sleeping patterns. Uh, it increases or stimulates respiration, because of its effects on the sympathetic nervous system. Use of cocaine can cause weight loss, okay, because the individual's resources are diverted elsewhere. They are time, okay, and money. They're engaging in behaviors other than eating. Their monetary resources are also devoted to purchasing or procuring the drug. And then we'll address this a bit later on when we summarize some things about amphetamine as well. That simply, one of the other issues here is that, the psychomotor stimulants affect the region of the brain, the hypothalamus, that's involved in food regulation and so forth, okay? Or appetite regulation and so forth, okay? Uh, and then effects on mood. So we know that the individual can have these feelings of well-being, the elation, and the high, the euphoria, but we also know that they can experience the um, depression as part of the letdown, okay? And then a bit later, we're going to also talk about things that are not necessarily changes in mood, but more so the psychological state of the individual that have some significant implications, okay? Here are some. The psychological states that are associated with cocaine use: the euphoria, that's the high, the rush, the buzz that people feel when they are taking cocaine, okay? The second psychological state is dysphoria, or the inability to enjoy anything, a general dissatisfaction, okay? And then you have paranoia, everybody's out to get me. And then we have schizopsychosis. When we talk about schizopsychosis, those are symptoms that are indistinguishable from schizophrenia, okay? And I have the asterisk there because you don't need to go through the other three steps, or these other three stages or states to experience schizopsychosis. A single large enough dose of cocaine can throw an individual into a psychotic episode. A single large enough dose of an amphetamine can throw an individual into schizopsychosis, okay? Which would require treatment with antipsychotic drugs, okay? So not a good thing, okay? Here we'll talk just a little bit, some more general effects. Cocaine in the heart. Okay, so it's going to disrupt the rhythm of the heart. The heart is going to beat rapidly and forcefully, but you're going to get constriction of blood vessels that are bringing blood to the heart. So you don't have blood coming into the heart. Okay, and so what happens is that the heart loses its rhythmicity. The heart ordinarily has a beat, a pattern, okay, of beating, okay, and as a result of cocaine use, okay, and constricting those blood vessels, bringing blood to the heart is going to lose its rhythmicity, and so you have what's called fibrillation. You've probably heard the term defibrillation because ambulances, high schools have defibrillators, things that will shock the heart back into rhythm. But when we talk about fibrillation, the heart has lost its rhythmicity, and so the heart stops pumping effectively and it just shakes like jello. Okay, so it doesn't have a rhythmic beating pattern. That's called fibrillation. And when we use defibrillators, you are electrically shocking the heart, okay, trying to get those action potentials to get the heart to beat, okay, again in a regular pattern, okay? More on the local vasoconstrictive properties of cocaine. Earlier in the chapter, we talked about constricting blood flow to parts of the nose and ending up with holes in the septum because tissue dies because of the lack of blood flow. But there are also reports of used to be an individual who had auto amputation of part of his penis after he repeatedly inserted cocaine into his urethra. Okay, remember, it constricts blood flow. That means that the surrounding tissue, does not get blood, and that tissue dies. Okay, and so once that tissue dies, it can fall off. Okay, let's see what we've got next. Okay, these are just some of the many consequences that are associated with cocaine use: panic attacks, psychosis, irritability, misperception, paranoid thought, of course, the impaired interpersonal relationships, headaches, seizures, sleeping disturbances, cerebral hemorrhaging, convulsions, sensory loss on one side of the body, visual impairments, myocardial infarctions, heart attacks. Okay, a little bit later we'll talk about the cane reaction, but just a slide or two ago we talked about constriction of the vessels that are bringing blood to the heart. Okay, so all in all, not not good news. Okay, so we'll stop here and I'll pick up in just a bit.